Every parent knows the heartache of watching their child go without. But when Carlos Mendoza saw another child going hungry, he made a choice that would echo through decades. 20 years ago, Cal was a single father working double shifts at the factory. Money was tight, but when he noticed a quiet boy in his daughter's class sitting alone with no lunch, Cal quietly started paying for the child's meals. He never told anyone, not even his own kids. It meant Cal often went without lunch himself, but he believed kindness should be invisible. The boy never knew who was helping him, but those daily meals gave him the strength to focus on his studies. Today, Cal's factory has closed, and he drives rideshare at night to pay the bills. One morning, he finds a luxury car in his driveway with a note, "For the man who fed my dreams." But what Cal doesn't know is how this one act of kindness is about to change everything for his entire town. What happens when a forgotten good deed comes back 20 years later? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Carlos Mendoza had always been an early riser, but these days it wasn't by choice. At 58, his body carried the weight of 3 decades spent on factory floors, and sleep came in fragments between the ache in his lower back and the worry that gnawed at his chest. This particular Tuesday morning in late October, he sat at his kitchen table nursing his second cup of coffee, watching the sun paint golden streaks across the small apartment he'd called home for the past 2 years. The apartment was a far cry from the house where he'd raised his children. That house with its 3 bedrooms, fenced yard, and Elena's carefully tended vegetable garden had been sold to cover medical bills after the cancer took her 8 years ago. Now he lived in a 2-bedroom unit in the Riverside apartments, where the walls were thin enough to hear Mrs. Chen's television through the night, and the parking lot stayed busy with the comings and goings of people working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Cal's worn factory badge sat on the kitchen counter beside his keys, a relic from his 30-year career at Millbrook Manufacturing. The plastic was cracked, the photo faded, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It represented something more than employment. It was proof of honest work, of showing up every day regardless of how he felt, of the pride that came from building something with your hands. The badge bore the name Carlos Mendoza, in block letters, beneath a picture of a much younger man, with hope still bright in his eyes. Millbrook had closed 18 months ago, taking with it not just Cal's steady paycheck, but the heartbeat of their entire community. The plant had employed nearly 400 people, and when the doors shuttered, it sent ripples through every family, every business, every dream in their small town. Some folks had moved away, chasing opportunities in bigger cities. Others, like Cal, had stayed, unwilling or unable to abandon the place that held their memories. These days, Cal drove for a rideshare company, picking up passengers at all hours of the day and night. It wasn't steady work, and it certainly wasn't what he'd imagined for his late 50s, but it paid enough to cover rent, utilities, and groceries. He'd grown accustomed to the rhythm of checking his phone for ride requests, navigating through traffic, making small talk with strangers who climbed into his back seat, carrying their own stories of struggle and hope. The sound of a door opening down the hall drew his attention. That would be Maria, his eldest, heading out for her morning run before classes. At 26, she had inherited her mother's determination and her father's quiet strength. She was in her 3rd year of medical school, a dream that had seemed impossible when she was growing up in a factory town. But Elena had planted that seed early, always telling Maria she was smart enough to be anything she wanted. "Morning, Dad," Maria called softly as she passed his door. She knew he'd be up, coffee in hand, mentally preparing for another day of hustling to keep their small family afloat. "Have a good run, mija," he replied, his voice carrying the warmth that had sustained his children through their mother's illness and death, through the uncertainty that followed. Diego, his 20-year-old son, was still asleep in the bedroom they shared. The boy had finished high school 2 years ago, with grades good enough for college, but the timing never seemed right. First, Elena's medical bills had drained their savings. Then the factory closed, and Diego insisted on working to help support the family, rather than taking on student loans. He had a job at the grocery store and talked about maybe starting community college next semester, but Cal could see the restlessness in his son's eyes, the way he looked toward the highway that led out of town. Cal finished his coffee and picked up his phone to check for ride requests. The morning rush was starting, and he'd learned that being available early could mean the difference between a good day and a struggling one. As he scrolled through the app, his mind wandered to a conversation he'd had with Elena just days before she died. "Cal," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the hospital machines. "You remember that boy at school, the one you helped?" He had remembered, of course. 20 years earlier, when Maria was in 3rd grade, he'd noticed a child in her class who never seemed to have lunch. The boy was quiet, almost invisible, sitting alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria while other kids chatted over their sandwiches and juice boxes. Cal had asked Maria about him, careful not to seem like he was prying, and learned that the boy's name was Jordan, that he lived with a foster family, and that he often went without lunch. Without telling Agnonino, even Elena, at first, Cal had started paying for Jordan's meals. He'd approach the cafeteria supervisor discreetly, hand her enough cash to cover the boys' lunches for the week, and ask that it remain anonymous. It meant tighter grocery budgets at home, more peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. But Cal had grown up poor himself, and remembered the shame that came with hunger. "You never told him it was you," Elena had continued that day in the hospital, her eyes bright, despite the weakness in her body. "Didn't seem right to," Cal had replied. "Kid deserved his dignity." Elena had smiled at that, the same smile she'd given him when they first met at the community center dance 28 years earlier. "That's why I married you, Carlos Mendoza. You understand that kindness works best when nobody's watching." Now, sitting in his small kitchen with the morning light growing stronger, Cal wondered what had become of that boy. Jordan something, he'd never learned the last name. Probably graduated, moved away like so many kids from their town did. Cal hoped he'd made something of himself, that those daily lunches had given him the energy to focus on his studies, to build a life beyond the limitations that poverty tried to impose. The phone in his hand buzzed with a ride request from the airport. Good money, that one, especially if the passenger needed to go downtown. Cal grabbed his keys, pocketed the factory badge out of habit, and headed for the door. Another day, another chance to earn enough to keep his family together, to support Maria's dreams of becoming a doctor, to give Diego time to figure out his own path. As he walked to his car, a 10-year-old Honda with nearly 200,000 miles on it, Cal nodded to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was watering the small flower boxes outside her apartment. She'd lived in the complex longer than anyone, and her presence was like an anchor in a place where people came and went based on their changing circumstances. "Buenos dias, Carlos," she called, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her native Spanish. "Another early start." "Always, Mrs. Rodriguez. You take care now." "You too, my Jo. Drive safe." The exchange was brief but meaningful, part of the fabric of small kindnesses that held their community together. Cal had learned that lesson from Elena, from his own parents who had worked multiple jobs to keep their family housed and fed, and from the countless small-town neighbors who had helped each other through difficult times without fanfare or expectation of recognition. He climbed into his Honda and started the engine, the familiar sound of the aging vehicle, a reminder of how far his life had traveled from those early dreams of financial security and comfortable retirement. But as he backed out of his parking space and headed toward the airport pickup, Cal felt something he'd carried with him through every challenge. The quiet satisfaction that came from doing right by the people around him, especially when nobody was keeping score. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made even familiar streets look touched with possibility. Cal drove through neighborhoods he knew by heart, past the closed factory with its empty parking lot, past the school where his children had learned to read and dream, past the small businesses that struggled to survive in a town still recovering from economic loss. He had no way of knowing that this ordinary Tuesday morning would be the last time he drove these streets as just another man trying to make ends meet. He had no way of knowing that the seeds of kindness he'd planted 2 decades earlier were about to bloom in ways he could never have imagined. All he knew was that another day stretched ahead of him, full of small opportunities to be helpful, to be decent, to be the kind of man Elena had fallen in love with, and the kind of father his children could be proud of. And that, Cal reflected as he merged onto the highway toward the airport, was enough. It had always been enough. 3 weeks later, Cal returned home from his longest shift, yet 14 hours of airport runs, late-night pickups from bars, and early morning commutes for people who worked jobs that still offered benefits and retirement plans. His back ached, his eyes burned from the glare of headlights, and all he wanted was a hot shower and 6 hours of sleep before starting over again. It was just past dawn when he turned onto his street, the sky painted in soft pastels that reminded him of the watercolor sets Elena used to buy for the kids when they were small. Most of the apartment complex was still quiet, windows dark except for the occasional glow of early risers preparing for their own work days. Cal was fumbling for his parking space when he saw it. A sleek black sedan sat in his assigned spot, its paint so pristine it seemed to absorb and reflect the morning light simultaneously. The car was massive, elegant, in a way that spoke of serious money, and it was wrapped with an enormous gold ribbon that caught the breeze like a celebration banner. Cal stopped his Honda in the middle of the parking lot, engine idling, and stared. This wasn't his car. This wasn't anyone's car from his neighborhood. He parked in a visitor's spot and approached the vehicle cautiously, the way a person might approach an animal they weren't sure was friendly. The car had to be worth more than he'd made in the past 2 years combined. As he got closer, he could see it was electric, no exhaust pipe, charging port visible near the front wheel, the kind of silent luxury that tech executives and movie stars drove. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper, folded neatly and sealed with what looked like wax. Cal looked around the parking lot, expecting someone to emerge and explain this obvious mistake. But the morning remained quiet, except for Mrs. Chen's dog barking from behind her patio door. With shaking hands, Cal pulled the note free and unfolded it. The paper was thick, expensive, and the writing was done by hand in careful block letters. Mr. Mendoza, 20 years ago, you paid for my lunch every day when I had nothing. You never knew my name, and I never knew yours, but your kindness kept me fed and gave me the dignity to focus on my studies instead of my empty stomach. I built my company on the belief that small acts of generosity can change the world. This car is the smallest possible thank you for the biggest possible gift. You fed my dreams when I was hungry, and now I want to return the favor. The keys are with Mrs. Rodriguez in 2B. Please accept this, with the same grace you showed when you helped a scared foster kid who needed a friend. J. Lee, Jordan Lee. Cal read the note 3 times before the words began to make sense. Jordan, the quiet boy from Maria's 3rd grade class. The child who had sat alone in the cafeteria corner, thin shoulders hunched over an empty lunch tray until Cal had started paying for his meals. That boy was now someone who could afford to give away cars that cost more than most people's houses. Mr. Carlos? Mrs. Rodriguez's voice came from behind him. She was approaching with her small dog on a leash, her usual morning routine, but her expression was bright with curiosity. There's a young man been waiting for you, very polite. He gave me these to hold. She reached into her pocket and produced a set of keys attached to a fob that looked more like a piece of modern art than a car accessory. Waiting for me. See, all night. He's been sitting in the lobby since maybe 2 in the morning, didn't want to wake anyone, just asked if he could wait. I brought him coffee around 5. Mrs. Rodriguez studied Cal's face, clearly reading his confusion. You know this person? Cal looked at the note again, then at the impossible car, then at the keys Mrs. Rodriguez was offering. I helped him when he was a kid. I didn't know. I never thought. Bueno, Mrs. Rodriguez said with the practical wisdom of someone who had lived through enough surprises to know when to ask questions. and when to simply accept. Maybe you should talk to him. The lobby of the Riverside Apartments wasn't much to look at: worn furniture donated by various residents over the years, a few magazines, a bulletin board covered with notices about lost cats and community events. But sitting in one of the mismatched chairs was a man who clearly didn't belong in this setting. He was tall, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested personal assistance and expensive haircuts. His clothes were simple jeans and a sweater, but even Cal could tell they cost more than most people spent on clothing in a year. Despite his obvious wealth, there was something tentative about the way he sat, as if he wasn't sure he belonged anywhere. When he saw Cal enter, the man stood immediately, and Cal caught a glimpse of the boy. He remembered something in the posture, the careful way he held himself, the expression that was equal parts hope and fear. "Mr. Mendoza," the man said, and his voice was quiet, respectful. "I'm Jordan Lee. I don't know if you remember me, but—" "I remember you," Cal said softly. "You sat by yourself at lunch. Quiet kid." Jordan's face brightened, and for a moment he looked exactly like the 8-year-old boy who had been too proud to ask for help but too hungry to refuse it when it appeared. "You do remember?" "Course I do. You were in Maria's class. 3rd grade, Mrs. Patterson." "You changed my life," Jordan said simply. "Those lunches, they weren't just food. They were hope. They meant someone cared enough to make sure I didn't go hungry." Cal shifted uncomfortably. He'd never been good with gratitude, especially not for something he'd considered basic human decency. Any parent would have done the same. "But you weren't my parent," Jordan replied. "You were just a good man who saw a kid in need and decided to help. No fanfare, no recognition, no asking for anything in return." He gestured toward the window, where the black sedan sat gleaming in the morning sun. "I wanted to say thank you." Cal looked at the car, then back at Jordan. "Son, that's a mighty generous gesture, but I can't accept something like that. It's too much." "Mr. Mendoza, I'm worth about $3 billion, Jordan said matter-of-factly. "I built a company that makes electric vehicles, clean energy systems, sustainable transportation. Everything I've accomplished started with those lunches you bought me. This car represents about 40 minutes of my company's revenue." The numbers were so large they felt abstract, but the emotion in Jordan's voice was concrete and real. Cal could see this wasn't about showing off wealth, it was about completing a circle that had been open for 20 years. "I appreciate the thought," Cal said carefully. "I truly do, but I've got no use for a car like that. Wouldn't even know how to drive it properly." Jordan's expression shifted, and Cal recognized the look of someone recalculating their approach. "What if I told you this wasn't really about the car?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I told you I've been looking for ways to give back to communities like this one? What if this car was just my way of saying hello? And what I really want to talk about is how we might be able to help your whole neighborhood." Cal studied Jordan's face, looking for the calculation that often came with promises from wealthy people who had discovered charity as a tax write-off. But all he saw was sincerity, and underneath that, the same quiet determination he remembered from the boy who had endured hunger with dignity. "What kind of help?" Cal asked. Jordan smiled, and it was the first completely relaxed expression Cal had seen from him. "The kind that starts with listening. The kind that asks what people actually need, instead of assuming what they should want." He paused. "The kind that keeps its promises even when nobody's watching." Outside, the morning was fully awake now. Cal could hear car doors slamming as people left for work, could see through the window as Mrs. Rodriguez walked her dog past the impossible black sedan that had appeared in his parking space, like something from a dream. "You want to get some breakfast?" Cal asked. "There's a diner down the road. Nothing fancy, but the coffee's good, and we can talk without folks staring at that car of yours." "I'd like that very much," Jordan said. As they walked toward the exit, Cal caught sight of the keys Mrs. Rodriguez had given him, still clutched in his hand. He stopped, turned back to Jordan, and held them out. "Here, you'll need these to move your car." Jordan looked at the keys but didn't take them. "Mr. Mendoza, with respect, I bought that car for you. Where I park it is entirely up to you." And with that, he pushed open the lobby door and stepped into the morning sun, leaving Cal standing there with a set of keys to a future he couldn't yet imagine. The Millbrook manufacturing plant sat on 12 acres at the edge of town, its red brick buildings and tall windows, designed in an era when factories were built to last generations. Cal had walked through these gates every weekday for 30 years, had known every corner of the production floor, every quirk of the machinery, every shortcut between departments. Now, 3 days after Jordan's surprise arrival, he was seeing it through different eyes. "It's bigger than I imagined," Jordan said, as they stood in the empty parking lot. He pulled a tablet from his jacket and began taking notes, his movements quick and efficient. "The infrastructure is solid. Electrical systems will need upgrading, but the bones are good." Cal watched Jordan document everything: the loading docks, the office buildings, the employee entrance where he'd badged in countless mornings. The factory blueprint Jordan held was a copy of the original architectural plans, procured somehow through connections Cal didn't want to think about too carefully. The papers were yellowed with age but still clear, showing every room, every production line, every possibility. "This was the main assembly area," Cal said, pointing to the largest building. "We made automotive parts, mostly for the Detroit companies." "Good work, steady work." His voice carried the weight of loss, of dignity stripped away when global economics decided his skills were no longer valuable. "How many people worked here at peak?" "About 400 on the day shift, maybe 150 at night. Everybody knew everybody. You couldn't walk through town without running into someone who worked here, or whose spouse worked here, or whose kids planned to work here someday." Jordan made more notes, occasionally looking up from his tablet to study the buildings with the intensity of someone seeing possibilities rather than ruins. "What I'm thinking," he said carefully, "is converting this into a manufacturing facility for affordable electric vehicles. Not luxury cars like the one I gave you, but practical, reliable transportation for working families." Cal felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in months. But he'd learned to be cautious about hope, especially when it came from people who had never needed to count grocery money. "Sounds ambitious." "It is ambitious, but it's also necessary." Jordan tucked his tablet under his arm and turned to face Cal directly. "The automotive industry is changing whether we want it to or not. Electric vehicles aren't a fad, they're the future. The question is whether that future includes communities like this one or leaves them behind." They drove back toward town in Jordan's rental car. He'd insisted on something more modest after seeing how the Tesla had attracted attention, and stopped at Rosa's house first. Rosa Martinez had been a floor supervisor at Millbrook for 15 years before the closure, and if anyone understood how the plant actually worked, it was her. She answered the door with paint-stained hands and a skeptical expression that softened only slightly when she recognized Cal. Rosa was 43, a single mother who had raised 2 kids on factory wages and had the kind of practical intelligence that came from solving real problems with limited resources. "This is the tech guy you mentioned?" she asked, studying Jordan with the wariness of someone who had heard too many promises from people in expensive clothes. "Rosa Martinez, Jordan Lee," Cal said. "Jordan, Rosa knows more about manufacturing than most folks with engineering degrees." Jordan extended his hand. "Ms. Martinez, I'm hoping you'll help me understand what it would really take to retool this facility for modern production." Rosa looked at his hand for a moment before shaking it firmly. "Depends what you're trying to produce and how much money you're willing to spend on people instead of machines. Electric vehicles, entry-level pricing, and I'm very willing to invest in people." "Huh." Rosa wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped back from the door. "You better come in. This conversation's going to take a while." Rosa's living room was small but comfortable, filled with photos of her children and artwork they'd made in school. The furniture was worn but clean, and Cal felt immediately at home in a way he never could in Jordan's sterile corporate world. "First thing you need to understand," Rosa began, settling into her favorite chair, "is that building cars isn't like building computers. It's not just about having the right software. You need people who understand metal, who can troubleshoot assembly lines, who know the difference between a part that meets spec and a part that'll fail in 6 months. Jordan leaned forward, genuinely interested. That's exactly the kind of expertise I'm looking for. Second thing, Rosa continued, is that most of our experienced workers are over 40. They've got mortgages, kids in school, elderly parents to take care of. They can't afford to relocate for jobs, and they can't afford to go back to school for retraining unless you're paying them while they learn. What would a retraining program need to look like? Rosa and Cal exchanged glances. This was the question that separated serious proposals from feel-good publicity stunts. 6 months minimum, Rosa said. Full-time, full pay. Electric vehicle assembly uses different techniques than traditional automotive. Battery installation, software integration, quality control for electronic system sits, a whole new skill set. And not everyone's going to make the transition, Cal added gently. Some folks are close to retirement, others might not want to learn new methods after decades of doing things a certain way. Jordan made notes on his tablet, nodding. What about union representation? Would the workers want to organize? Damn right they would, Rosa said immediately. And you better be prepared for that conversation from day one. Workers aren't going to trust a billionaire who shows up promising to save their town unless they have real power to negotiate wages, benefits, and working conditions. This was the moment Cal had been waiting for, the moment when Jordan's good intentions would meet the reality of blue-collar economics. Too many wealthy people talked about helping communities without understanding that help meant giving up control, meant sharing power, meant accepting that the people being helped knew things the helpers didn't. Jordan was quiet for a long moment, and Cal could almost see him processing the implications. Finally, he looked up from his tablet. Martinez, would you be willing to lead a worker transition committee? Help me understand what people actually need instead of what I think they should want. Rosa studied his face, looking for signs of condescension or calculation. What's the pay? Whatever you were making as a supervisor, plus 20% for the additional responsibility. And I get to tell you when your ideas are stupid? Jordan actually smiled at that. I'm counting on it. After they left Rosa's house, they stopped by Pete's garage. Pete Kowalski was 62, a master mechanic who had worked at Millbrook for 28 years before starting his own small repair shop when the factory closed. If anyone could assess the practical challenges of retooling the plant, it was Pete. They found him under the hood of an ancient pickup truck, his work clothes stained with oil, and his hands moving with the confident precision of someone who understood machinery at a fundamental level. Pete, Cal called. Got someone I'd like you to meet. Pete straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that looked like it had seen decades of service. He was a big man with a grey beard and eyes that missed nothing when it came to mechanical systems. This the fellow with the fancy car? Pete asked, looking Jordan up and down. Guilty as charged, Jordan replied. I'm hoping you'll tell me whether my business plan is realistic or just expensive wishful thinking. Pete grunted, which Cal knew was about as close to approval as the mechanic gave to strangers. Let's see this plan of yours. Jordan spread the factory blueprint on Pete's workbench, weighing down the corners with wrenches. The idea is to retrofit the main assembly building for electric vehicle production. Small, affordable cars for the domestic market. Pete studied the blueprint with the same intensity he brought to diagnosing engine problems. You ever actually built a car before? I've built the companies that build cars, Jordan said. But no, I've never personally assembled a vehicle. Good answer, Pete said, surprising Cal with his approval. Honest, at least. He pointed to various areas of the blueprint. Your main challenge isn't going to be the assembly process that's just engineering. Your challenge is going to be supply chain. Where are you getting your batteries, your electric motors, your electronic control systems? Jordan's confidence seemed to waver slightly. I was planning to source components from existing suppliers. Pete shook his head. Son, you're talking about competing with Tesla, Ford, GM companies that buy components by the millions. You think those suppliers are going to give the same pricing to a startup factory in a small town? It was a sobering question, and Cal could see Jordan's enthusiasm deflating as he confronted the realities of manufacturing economics. But Pete wasn't finished. That said, he continued, if you could work out the supply chain issues, this town's got some of the best manufacturing workers you'll find anywhere. People here don't just build things, they build them right the first time. As they drove back toward the apartment complex, Jordan was quieter than he'd been all day. Cal could sense him wrestling with the gap between his vision and the practical challenges Rosa and Pete had outlined. Having second thoughts? Cal asked gently. Jordan looked out the window at the familiar streets, the small businesses struggling to survive, the empty lots where other factories had once provided stable employment. No, he said finally, but I'm starting to understand why most people don't try to rebuild entire communities. It's a lot more complicated than writing checks. Cal smiled. Elena used to say the hardest problems are worth solving precisely because they're hard. Easy problems get solved by accident. Your wife sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, and she would have liked you, I think. She always said you can tell someone's character by watching how they handle being wrong about something. Jordan considered that as they pulled into the parking lot, where his Tesla still sat like a beautiful, expensive question mark. How am I handling it? He asked. So far, so good, Cal replied, but we're just getting started. Cal's apartment had never hosted anyone like Jordan Lee, but Elena's recipe box sat on the kitchen counter like a bridge between worlds. The wooden box was worn smooth from decades of use, its corners softened by Elena's gentle handling as she'd planned meals for a growing family on a factory worker's budget. Tonight, Cal was making her famous beef stew, the recipe written in her careful handwriting on an index card spotted with old cooking stains. She wrote down everything, Cal explained as he diced onions with practiced efficiency. Not just ingredients and measurements, but little notes about timing, about which spices to add when the kids were getting over colds, about how to stretch the portions when money was tight. Jordan sat at the small kitchen table, looking oddly formal in the humble space, despite having changed into jeans and a simple shirt. Did she teach Maria and Diego to cook? Tried to. Maria learned enough to keep herself fed in medical school, but Diego, that boy, could burn water. Cal smiled at the memory. Elena used to say cooking was about more than food. It was about taking care of people, about making something from nothing, about showing love in a way that didn't require words. The apartment felt different with a guest present. Maria had cleaned the living room before leaving for her evening shift at the hospital, and Diego had actually made his bed for the first time in months. Both of Cal's children were curious about Jordan, but trying to maintain appropriate distance Maria, because she was naturally cautious about people who seemed too good to be true. Diego, because he was protective of his father and suspicious of wealthy strangers bearing gifts. Tell me about them, Jordan said as Cal added vegetables to the pot. Your children. Cal's face brightened the way it always did when people asked about Maria and Diego. Maria's the smartest person I've ever known. Got Elena's determination and her mother's heart for helping people. She's going to be a doctor, specializes in family medicine. Wants to work in communities like this one, places where people can't always afford the best care. And Diego? Diego's still figuring himself out. Good kid. Smart as his sister, but in different ways. He's got hands like Peter can fix anything, understands how things work just by looking at them. But he's been putting off college to help with expenses. Cal stirred the stew thoughtfully. Sometimes I think he's afraid to want something too much, in case it doesn't work out. Jordan absorbed this information quietly. Would it help if I talked to them? About the factory project, I mean. If this moves forward, there could be opportunities. Hold on there. Cal interrupted gently. You've known me for 3 days. They've been watching me struggle for 2 years. They're not going to trust you just because I say you're all right. Fair enough. How do I earn their trust? Cal considered the question while he seasoned the stew. Same way you earn anyone's trust, I suppose. You show up consistently, you do what you say you're going to do, and you listen more than you talk. When Maria arrived home from her hospital shift an hour later, she found Cal and Jordan washing dishes and discussing the technical challenges of battery supply chains. She paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of her father, engaged in animated conversation with someone who clearly understood manufacturing in ways that went beyond theory. "Smells good in here," she said, dropping her backpack by the door and accepting Cal's hug. "Jordan, this is my daughter Maria. Maria, Jordan Lee." Maria shook Jordan's hand with the firm grip she'd learned in medical training. "The car owner." "Among other things," Jordan replied. "Your father tells me you're in medical school. Family medicine. 3rd year." Maria's tone was polite but reserved. "Dad says you want to reopen the factory." "I want to try. Whether it works depends on a lot of factors, including whether the community thinks it's a good idea." Maria poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the kitchen counter, studying Jordan with the analytical gaze she'd developed for diagnosing difficult cases. "What's your success rate with projects like this?" "0, Jordan said honestly. "This would be my first attempt at community-based manufacturing." "Honest answer," Maria admitted. "I appreciate that." She glanced at her father, who was ladling stew into bowls with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed feeding people. "Dad's told you about the challenges, the unemployment rate, the brain drain, the infrastructure problems?" "Some of them. I'm learning that reality is more complicated than my initial research suggested." Diego arrived, just as they were sitting down to eat, his grocery store uniform wrinkled from a long shift, and his expression guarded when he saw Jordan at their table. At 20, Diego had their mother's dark eyes and Cal's cautious nature, but underneath the wariness was a young man trying to figure out his place in a world that seemed to offer limited options for people like him. "Diego, this is Jordan," Cal said. "Jordan, my son Diego." "The guy with the Tesla," Diego said, shaking hands briefly before taking his seat. "That's me," Jordan replied. "Your dad's been telling me about your mechanical abilities." Diego shrugged. "I know my way around engines." As they ate Elena's stew, the conversation gradually warmed. Jordan asked thoughtful questions about their lives, their hopes, their concerns about the future. He didn't offer solutions or make promises, just listened with the kind of attention that suggested he was genuinely interested in their answers. "The thing about this town," Diego said eventually, "is that people here aren't looking for charity. They want to work, want to contribute something meaningful. But most of the jobs that are left don't pay enough to live on." "What would meaningful work look like to you?" Jordan asked. Diego considered the question seriously. "Something where you could see the result of your effort. Where you're building something that matters, not just processing paperwork or selling things people don't really need." He paused. "Like what Dad used to do at the factory. He'd come home tired but satisfied because he'd helped make something real." Maria nodded agreement. "Medical school is expensive, and I'll have loans to pay back, but at least I know I'll be helping people directly. There's dignity in that kind of work." "There's dignity in all honest work," Cal added quietly, "but it helps when the work feels connected to something larger than yourself." After dinner, Jordan helped with the dishes, despite Cal's protests. As they cleaned up, he noticed family photos covering the refrigerator school pictures, graduation ceremonies, candid moments of a family that had weathered loss and financial hardship without losing their connection to each other. "Your father paid for my lunches when I was 8 years old," Jordan told Maria and Diego as they dried the last of the dishes. "Not because he knew me, not because anyone asked him to, just because he saw a kid who needed help." "That sounds like Dad," Maria said softly. "I've spent 20 years trying to figure out how to repay that kindness. I built a successful company, made more money than I ever expected, but none of it felt like enough. When I finally tracked him down and saw this community, I realized maybe the way to honor what he did is to help create opportunities for other people to show that same kind of generosity." Diego looked at his father, who was putting leftover stew into containers with the careful efficiency of someone who never wasted food. "You never told us about that, about helping some kid at school." Cal shrugged. Didn't seem worth mentioning. Elena and I helped people when we could. Most folks do. Not everyone, Jordan said quietly. Not when it costs them something they can't afford to lose. Later, after Jordan had left for his hotel and the apartment had settled into its usual evening rhythm, Maria sat with her father in the living room while Diego studied for his GED prep test at the kitchen table. "What do you think?" she asked. "About his factory idea?" Cal was quiet for a long moment, holding Elena's recipe box in his lap and thinking about the evening's conversation. "I think he means well. I think he's got the resources to make something happen. But good intentions and money aren't enough to rebuild a community. What else does it take? Trust, time, and the willingness to let people have a real say in their own future instead of just being grateful for whatever help they're offered." Maria considered this. "Do you trust him?" "I'm starting to. But trust is earned one conversation at a time, one kept promise at a time." Cal opened the recipe box and pulled out Elena's card for apple pie, her handwriting as familiar as her voice had once been. "Your mother always said you can tell someone's character by how they treat people who can't do anything for them." So far, Jordan's passing that test. From the kitchen came the sound of Diego's pencil scratching against paper as he worked through math problems, preparing for a future that had seemed uncertain just days earlier, but was beginning to feel like it might hold possibilities none of them had imagined. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees around the apartment complex, carrying with it the scent of changing seasons and the promise that sometimes, if you're patient enough and brave enough to hope, even the most ordinary lives can be touched by extraordinary grace. The investor presentation Jordan spread across the conference table at the Holiday Inn was a masterpiece of corporate polished glossy charts, financial projections, market analysis, graphs that transformed human struggles into data points. Cal sat at one end of the table feeling distinctly out of place among the three venture capitalists who had flown in from Silicon Valley to evaluate Jordan's proposal. The total addressable market for affordable electric vehicles is projected to reach $200 billion by 2030, Jordan explained, clicking through slides with practiced efficiency. "Our cost structure analysis shows we can achieve profitability within 18 months of production launch." Marcus Chen, the lead investor, was about Jordan's age but carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never needed to worry about grocery money. "The numbers look solid on paper, but rural manufacturing presents significant challenges. Labor costs, logistics, supplier relationships. Why not locate this facility in an established automotive corridor?" "Because," Jordan replied, "this isn't just about maximizing profits. It's about proving that American manufacturing can be economically viable in communities that have been left behind." "Noble sentiment," said Sarah Williams, the second investor. "But our fiduciary responsibility is to your shareholders, not to social engineering experiments." Cal listened to the conversation with growing unease. These people spoke about his community like it was a problem to be solved, rather than a place where real families lived and worked. They used phrases like human capital optimization and productivity metrics to describe neighbors he'd known for decades. "Mr. Mendoza," Marcus said, turning his attention to Cal for the first time, "you worked at the original factory. What's your assessment of the local workforce?" Cal chose his words carefully. "The people here are skilled, reliable, and proud of their work. They want to contribute to something meaningful, not just collect paychecks. But can they adapt to modern manufacturing techniques? Electric vehicle assembly requires significantly different skill sets than traditional automotive production." "With proper training and support, absolutely," Cal replied. "Rosa Martinez could organize a training program that would have workers ready faster and better than any corporate consultant." Sarah made notes on her tablet, but her expression remained skeptical. "Training programs are expensive. How do we quantify the return on that investment?" "You measure it by the quality of the work and the stability of your workforce," Cal said, his voice carrying a slight edge. "People who are invested in their community don't job hop every time someone offers them an extra $1 an hour." The third investor, David Park, had been quiet throughout most of the presentation. Now he leaned forward, studying the financial projections more carefully. Jordan, your cost estimates seem optimistic. Labor rates, regulatory compliance, environmental remediation. Have you factored in the full scope of startup expenses? Jordan's confidence wavered slightly. We've done preliminary assessments. Preliminary doesn't cut it when we're talking about $100 million investment. Marcus interrupted. We need comprehensive due diligence, environmental impact studies, workforce productivity analyses. Cal could see where this was heading. These investors weren't interested in rebuilding communities, they were interested in profit margins and exit strategies. The human element that made Jordan's proposal meaningful was exactly what made it risky from their perspective. There's something else to consider, Cal said quietly. The people in this town aren't going to work for just anyone. They need to trust that their employer respects them, that their voices matter in workplace decisions. That's not something you can put in a spreadsheet. Sarah looked at him with thinly veiled condescension. Mr. Mendoza, with respect, modern manufacturing is about efficiency and precision. Emotional considerations can't drive business decisions. Ma'am, Cal replied, his tone still respectful but firm. I've seen what happens when businesses treat workers like replaceable parts. You get high turnover, quality problems, and eventually you get factories that close down because nobody cares enough to make them succeed. The tension in the room was palpable. Jordan looked uncomfortable, caught between his investors' demands and his commitment to Cal's community. The presentation that had seemed so promising on paper was revealing fundamental disagreements about values and priorities. Marcus closed his laptop with finality. Jordan, we appreciate the opportunity to review your proposal, but frankly, this project carries too many variables for our comfort level. If you want to reconsider the location somewhere with established infrastructure and a more compliant workforce, we'd be happy to revisit the conversation. What do you mean by compliant workforce? Cal asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Non-unionized, David said bluntly, right-to-work state. Minimal regulatory overhead. You mean somewhere people are desperate enough to accept whatever conditions you offer, Cal said, his patience finally exhausted. We mean somewhere market forces can operate efficiently without artificial constraints, Sarah replied coolly. Jordan stood up abruptly, gathering his presentation materials. Thank you for your time. I'll be in touch. The investors exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the abrupt end to the meeting. Marcus tried to salvage the situation. Jordan, don't let sentiment cloud your business judgment. This is a solid concept with the right execution strategy. The right execution strategy includes treating workers as partners, not resources, Jordan said firmly. If that's not something you can support, then we're not a good fit. After the investors left, Cal and Jordan sat in the empty conference room, surrounded by the remnants of corporate optimism. Jordan stared at his presentation folder, the glossy charts now seeming naive and disconnected from reality. That didn't go the way I hoped, Jordan said finally. No, it didn't, Cal agreed. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Jordan looked up, surprised. How do you figure? Those folks weren't interested in building anything lasting. They wanted quick returns and minimal complications. That's not the kind of partnership that would serve this community well. But without their funding, there are other ways to finance a project like this, Cal said thoughtfully. Other kinds of investors who might be more aligned with what you're trying to accomplish. Jordan leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 38 years. I've built my career on making smart financial decisions. But every smart financial decision those investors suggested felt wrong. Elena used to say that feeling wrong about something was usually your conscience trying to get your attention, Cal said. Maybe this is one of those times. They drove back through town in contemplative silence, past the shuttered storefronts and the factory that had once been the heart of their community's economy. Cal pointed out landmarks as they passed the school, where Jordan had once sat hungry, the diner where workers used to gather after shifts, the small houses where families had built lives around steady employment. "The thing about this place," Cal said as they pulled into the apartment complex, "is that people here understand the difference between being helped and being used. Those investors, they saw our community as a resource to be extracted from. That's not partnership, that's exploitation with better marketing." "So what do I do now?" Jordan asked. "I made promises to you, to Rosa, to Pete. I raised expectations." "You keep your promises," Cal said simply, "just maybe not the way you originally planned." That evening, Cal's apartment hosted an impromptu planning session. Rosa arrived with a folder full of notes about workforce development. Pete brought his toolbox and a thermos of coffee, and Maria and Diego joined them around the kitchen table that had become an unlikely headquarters for community organizing. "The way I see it," Rosa said, spreading her notes across the table, "we don't need Silicon Valley money if we're willing to start smaller and grow gradually." "What do you mean?" Jordan asked. "Instead of trying to build $100 million facility right away, what if we started with retrofit and repair, electric vehicle conversion, maintenance, component manufacturing, build up expertise and capital gradually?" Pete nodded agreement. "There's a growing market for converting existing vehicles to electric. Not everyone can afford a new car, but plenty of folks would pay to upgrade what they already have." "That's actually brilliant," Jordan said, his enthusiasm returning. "We could use the factory space for conversion services while we develop the infrastructure for new vehicle production." Diego, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Could create apprenticeship programs too, train people on electric systems while they're earning money doing conversion work." Maria looked at her brother with surprise and pride. "That's a really smart idea, Diego." "Plus," Rosa added, "if we start with services and retrofitting, we prove to the community that this isn't just another outside company making promises. We demonstrate results before asking for trust." Jordan pulled out his tablet and began taking notes, but this time his approach was different, more collaborative, less corporate. "What would we need to get started with something like this?" "Tool inventory, basic workspace setup, maybe 6 months of operating capital," Pete said. "Nothing like what those fancy investors were talking about. And most importantly," Cal added, "we'd need to do this with the community, not for the community. People need to have real input into how this develops." Over the next 2 hours, they sketched out a plan that felt both ambitious and achievable. Jordan would provide initial funding for workspace setup and equipment. Rosa would organize a worker cooperative structure that gave employees ownership stakes in the business. Pete would lead technical training programs. Cal would serve as community liaison, ensuring that local voices remained central to decision-making. "This feels different," Jordan said as they wrapped up the evening's planning, "more real somehow." "That's because it is real," Rosa replied. "It's built on what people actually need instead of what looks good in a presentation." As the others prepared to leave, Maria pulled Jordan aside. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Why does this matter so much to you? I mean, you're already successful. You could invest your money in 100 different projects with better odds of success." Jordan was quiet for a moment, looking around the small apartment that had become the center of something important. 20 years ago, your father fed me when I was hungry. But more than that, he did it in a way that preserved my dignity. He didn't make me feel like a charity case or like I owed him anything. He just saw someone who needed help and helped. And now you want to do the same thing. I want to create a place where people can help each other the way your father helped me, where work has meaning beyond just earning money, where communities can take care of their own without having to depend on outsiders who don't understand what they're going through. Maria smiled, and for the first time since Jordan had arrived, Cal could see that she was beginning to believe in the possibility they were creating together. "In that case," she said, "you should know that Dad's been putting money aside from his rideshare earnings. Not much, but every week he adds something to an envelope marked Community Fund. He was saving up to help when the next family got hit with medical bills or unemployment." Jordan looked at Cal, who was carefully putting away Elena's recipe box and trying not to appear as though he'd been listening to their conversation. "How much has he saved?" Jordan asked quietly. about $3,000, took him 8 months. The amount was tiny compared to the millions Jordan could write a check for, but somehow it felt more significant than any corporate investment. It represented sacrifice, commitment, and the kind of faith that sustained communities through difficult times. "Maria," Jordan said, "would you ask your father if he'd be willing to make that the first deposit in our worker cooperative fund? Not because we need his money, but because we need his partnership." She looked across the room at Cal, who was pretending to be very interested in washing coffee cups, and smiled. "I think he'd like that very much." Pete's toolbox had traveled with him from job to job for 40 years, accumulating tools the way a life accumulates wisdom slowly, purposefully, with each addition earning its place through proven usefulness. Now it sat open on the factory floor, its contents spread across a makeshift workbench, as Pete explained electric motor fundamentals to a group of former Millbrook workers who had gathered for the first unofficial training session. "The thing about electric motors," Pete said, holding up a component that looked deceptively simple, "is they're both more complex and simpler than combustion engines. More complex because everything depends on precise electronic control. Simpler because there's a lot fewer moving parts to wear out." Cal watched from across the room as Jordan took notes with the intensity of a graduate student, asking technical questions that demonstrated both his intelligence and his recognition that he had much to learn. 3 weeks had passed since the disastrous investor meeting, and the alternative approach they'd developed was beginning to take shape in concrete ways. Rosa had negotiated a month-to-month lease on a section of the factory building for their pilot program, and the space was slowly transforming from industrial emptiness into something that resembled a working garage. They'd started with basic vehicle conversion services, installing electric drive systems in older cars and trucks for customers who wanted to reduce fuel costs without buying new vehicles. "Who's our first customer?" asked Tommy Chen, Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew, who had driven over from the next town to check out the program. "Mrs. Patterson, actually," Rosa replied with a smile. "Remember her? 3rd-grade teacher? She wants us to convert her 2008 Honda Civic. Says if it's good enough for her, she'll recommend us to other teachers in the district." The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Mrs. Patterson had been Jordan's teacher during those months, when Cal was quietly paying for his lunches. Now she was becoming their first customer, completing a circle that had begun with childhood hunger and was flowering into community renewal. "How long does a conversion take?" Jordan asked. "Depends on the vehicle and the customer's budget," Pete replied. "Basic conversion, maybe 2 weeks if we're not waiting on parts. More sophisticated systems could be a month or more." Diego had been mostly quiet during the technical discussions, but now he spoke up with the kind of insight that reminded Cal why his son's mechanical intelligence had always impressed teachers and frustrated guidance counselors who couldn't understand why he wasn't more interested in formal education. "The real challenge isn't the conversion process," Diego said. "It's customer education. People are scared of electric vehicles because they don't understand how they work. We need to build trust along with the cars." "What do you mean?" Jordan asked. "I mean, when someone brings us their car, they're not just paying for an upgraded motor. They're trusting us with their transportation, their livelihood, their family's safety. If we mess up, they can't get to work or take their kids to school." Rosa nodded appreciatively. "Diego's right. We need to think about this as customer service as much as technical service." "So what does good customer service look like in this context?" Jordan asked. Maria, who had stopped by during her lunch break from the hospital, offered her perspective. "Clear communication about what you're doing and why. Realistic timelines. Follow up to make sure everything's working properly. And most importantly, standing behind your work when something goes wrong." "Because something will go wrong," Pete added pragmatically. "That's not pessimism. That's reality. The question is whether you handle problems like a partner or like a vendor." They spent the afternoon working on Mrs. Patterson's Honda, with Pete guiding the process while Jordan, Diego, and 2 other former factory workers learned by doing. The conversion wasn't complicated in theory. remove the internal combustion engine and related systems, install electric motor and battery pack, integrate control electronics. But the practical details required constant problem-solving and adaptation. "This is why I never trusted those investors," Rosa said quietly to Cal as they watched Jordan struggle to route electrical cables through the car's chassis. They kept talking about scalability and efficiency, but they never asked about the actual work. "Man learns more about manufacturing in one afternoon than he would from 1,000 PowerPoint presentations," Cal agreed. Around 4 o'clock, local TV news arrived unannounced. The reporter was young, enthusiastic, and clearly hoping for a story about economic revitalization that would play well on the evening broadcast. Jordan handled the interview with appropriate caution, emphasizing the pilot nature of their program and the importance of community involvement in its development. "Is this part of a larger plan to bring manufacturing jobs back to the region?" the reporter asked. "This is part of a larger effort to create sustainable economic opportunities that build on the skills and values already present in this community," Jordan replied carefully. "We're not trying to recreate the past. We're trying to build a future that honors what's always been strong about places like this." Cal found himself impressed by Jordan's growing understanding of how to communicate about their work without over-promising or raising unrealistic expectations. The young billionaire was learning to think like a community member rather than a corporate executive. But not everyone was pleased with the attention. That evening, Cal received a phone call from Jim Morrison, a local businessman who owned several rental properties and had been vocal in his opposition to any changes that might disrupt the area's low-cost labor environment. "Cal, you need to think about what you're getting yourself into," Jim said without preamble. "This electric car nonsense is just another government boondoggle waiting to collapse. You're going to get people's hopes up for nothing." "Jim, we're not asking for government money or making promises we can't keep," Cal replied patiently. "We're just trying to provide a service people want." "Come on, Cal. You think some Silicon Valley hotshot really cares about this community? He's using you to make himself look good, and when the publicity dies down, he'll move on to the next project." Cal could hear the genuine concern beneath Jim's skepticism, but he could also hear something else: fear of change, fear of losing control over a situation that had benefited him even as it harmed others. "Jordan's been here every day for 3 weeks," Cal said, "learning alongside everyone else, listening to people's concerns, adapting his plans based on what we tell him we need. That doesn't look like a publicity stunt to me." "We'll see," Jim said, "but when this falls apart, remember that some of us tried to warn you." After he hung up, Cal sat in his kitchen thinking about the conversation. Jim wasn't entirely wrong to be skeptical. Plenty of outside promises had been made to communities like theirs over the years, and most had resulted in disappointment. The difference was that Jordan wasn't asking them to trust his promises. He was asking them to help him keep the promises they made together. Maria found him there an hour later, still sitting at the table with an untouched cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. "Dad, everything okay?" "Just thinking about something Jim Morrison said, about getting people's hopes up." Maria sat down across from him, still wearing her hospital scrubs. "Are you worried we're making a mistake?" Cal considered the question seriously. "I'm worried about a lot of things. I'm worried about whether we can really make this work. I'm worried about what happens if we fail. I'm worried about whether Jordan will stick around when things get difficult. But I'm more worried about what happens if we don't try. This community has been dying slowly for 2 years. People are leaving, businesses are closing, young folks like Diego are putting their lives on hold because there's no future here to invest in." Maria reached across the table and touched his hand. "Mom would be proud of what you're doing. Your mother would tell me to stop worrying about things I can't control and focus on the work in front of me," Cal replied with a smile. "She always said courage wasn't about not being scared, it was about being scared and doing the right thing anyway." "So what's the right thing?" Cal looked around the small apartment that had become a gathering place for people planning a different kind of future. "The right thing is to keep showing up, keep doing the work. Keep treating people with dignity and respect. Keep believing that small acts of kindness can echo across decades and change everything. Outside, the autumn evening was settling over their neighborhood, lights coming on in windows where families were gathered around dinner tables, sharing the events of their days and planning for tomorrow. In a few hours, Cal would drive his rideshare routes through the city, but tonight belonged to the community they were building together, one conversation and one converted car at a time. The environmental report arrived on a Tuesday morning like a death sentence wrapped in official letterhead. Cal found Jordan sitting in his car outside the factory, staring at the document with the stunned expression of someone whose entire worldview had just shifted. The morning sun, which had seemed so promising an hour earlier, now felt harsh and unforgiving. "How bad is it?" Cal asked, settling into the passenger seat. Jordan handed him the 20-page assessment without speaking. The technical language was dense, full of terms like subsurface contamination and remediation protocols. But the essential message was clear. Decades of industrial production had left the soil beneath the factory saturated with chemicals that would cost millions to clean up properly. $15 to $20 million, Jordan said finally. That's the estimated cost for environmental remediation before we can safely operate any kind of manufacturing facility. Cal read through the executive summary, his heart sinking with each paragraph. Heavy metals, petroleum byproducts, industrial solvents, the very ground they'd been planning to build their future on, was poisoned with the residue of economic activity that had sustained the community for generations. "Did you know?" Cal asked quietly. "When you first proposed this, I suspected there might be some contamination. Most industrial sites have some level of environmental issues. But nothing like this." Jordan's voice carried the weight of promises that suddenly seemed impossible to keep. "The preliminary assessment I commissioned was supposed to identify major problems. Either they missed this or someone wasn't being entirely honest about what they found," Cal finished. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the factory buildings that had transformed in their imaginations from symbols of economic decline to foundations for community renewal. Now those same buildings represented an obstacle that threatened to destroy everything they'd worked toward. "Your investors," Cal said, "the ones from Silicon Valley, they're going to hear about this." "Already have," Marcus called an hour ago. "They're formally withdrawing their offer, citing unforeseen environmental liabilities and project risk assessment failures." "So that's it then," Cal said, though he didn't want to believe it. Jordan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the factory with an expression Cal couldn't quite read. "Not necessarily. Jordan, you can't spend $20 million cleaning up contamination just to prove a point. What if it's not about proving a point? What if it's about doing what's right?" Cal studied the younger man's face, looking for signs of the kind of reckless idealism that wealthy people sometimes mistook for nobility. But what he saw instead was something deeper, a man grappling with the gap between good intentions and harsh realities, trying to find a path forward that didn't require abandoning either his principles or his responsibilities. "Son, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but $20 million is about 8% of my net worth," Jordan interrupted. "I'm not saying it's pocket change, but it's not going to bankrupt me either. That's not the point. The point is whether spending that much money on environmental cleanup is the best way to help this community." Jordan turned to face Cal directly. What would Elena say? The question caught Cal off guard. Jordan had never met Elena, had only heard stories about her wisdom and her approach to solving problems. But somehow he'd intuited that her perspective might cut through the complexity of their situation. Elena would ask whether we were making this decision based on fear or based on love, Cal said slowly. She'd want to know if we were trying to protect ourselves or trying to serve something larger. And what's the difference? Cal thought about his wife's approach to the difficult decisions they'd faced during their marriage, his periods of unemployment, her cancer diagnosis, the choice to keep helping Jordan's lunches, even when their own finances were strained. "Fear makes you try to control outcomes," he said. "Love makes you focus on doing the right thing and trusting that the outcome will take care of itself. So what's the right thing here? Before Cal could answer, Rosa's pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, followed by Pete's van and Diego's borrowed car. Word had somehow spread about the environmental report, and people were gathering to discuss what it meant for their plans. Rosa approached Jordan's car with the kind of direct purposefulness that had made her an effective factory supervisor. "We need to talk," she said through the window. They moved the conversation into the factory's former break room, a space that still smelled faintly of coffee and decades of workers' lunches. Rosa spread the environmental report across a table scarred by years of use, while Pete studied the technical diagrams with the focused attention he brought to any mechanical problem. "This is worse than we thought," Rosa said without preamble. "But it's not worse than what people in this community have been living with for years." "What do you mean?" Jordan asked. "I mean, we always knew this place was contaminated. We just didn't know how much or what it would cost to fix." She pointed to sections of the report. "My kids played in the creek that runs behind this factory. My neighbors have been breathing dust from this soil for decades. The contamination isn't news. The price tag for cleaning it up is." Diego nodded agreement. "Every kid who grew up here knows not to play in certain areas, not to drink from certain wells. We just accepted it as the cost of having jobs." "That's exactly the problem," Pete said, his voice carrying an anger Cal had rarely heard from the quiet mechanic. "We accepted poison as the price of survival. And now we have a chance to actually fix it, instead of just living with it." Jordan looked around the room at faces that reflected determination rather than discouragement. "You're saying we should move forward with the cleanup?" "I'm saying we should move forward with doing this right," Rosa replied. "If we're going to build something new here, let's build it on clean ground. Let's give our kids a workplace that doesn't slowly poison them the way this one poisoned us." "But the cost." "The cost is high," Cal interrupted. "But so is the cost of doing nothing. So is the cost of building our future on top of environmental problems that will eventually destroy whatever we create." Maria, who had been quiet during most of the discussion, spoke up from the back of the room. "From a public health perspective, environmental remediation isn't just about manufacturing safety. It's about community health, clean soil, clean water, clean air. Those benefits extend far beyond whatever factory we build here." Jordan pulled out his phone and started making notes, but his approach was different, now less corporate, more collaborative. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it transparently. Full community involvement in planning, regular progress reports, independent monitoring of the cleanup process. And we need to make sure the cleanup creates jobs for local people," Rosa added. "Environmental remediation requires workers. Why shouldn't those workers be from this community?" Over the next hour, they sketched out an approach that transformed the environmental contamination from an obstacle into an opportunity. Jordan would fund the cleanup, but it would be managed by a community oversight committee. Local workers would be trained in environmental remediation techniques, creating a skilled workforce that could take on similar projects in other locations. The process would be documented and shared as a model for other communities facing similar challenges. "This is going to take longer than we originally planned," Jordan said as they wrapped up the discussion. "Cleanup first, then construction. We're looking at 2 to 3 years before we're actually manufacturing vehicles." "Good things take time," Cal said. "Elena used to say that anything worth doing was worth doing slowly enough to do right." As the others prepared to leave, Jordan pulled Cal aside. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." "All right. Do you think I'm being naive, throwing good money after bad, making decisions based on emotion instead of logic?" Cal considered the question seriously. He thought about the young man who had arrived a month earlier, with a luxury car and grand plans, and compared him to the person who now sat in a contaminated factory break room, planning a cleanup that would cost millions and benefit people he barely knew. "I think you're learning the difference between being successful and being useful," Cal said finally. "Success is about achieving your goals. Usefulness is about serving something larger than yourself. And you think this cleanup serves something larger?" I think it serves the same thing that paying for a hungry kid's lunch served 20 years ago. It says that people matter more than profit, that dignity matters more than efficiency, that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. Jordan smiled, and for the first time since receiving the environmental report, he looked like someone who knew what direction he was heading. In that case, he said, I guess we better get started. That evening, Cal sat in his apartment with Elena's recipe box open in front of him, looking through cards that represented years of making something nutritious from simple ingredients. The environmental report lay on the table beside the recipes, and somehow the juxtaposition felt appropriate. Both documents were about transformation, about taking raw materials and turning them into something that could nourish and sustain. Maria found him there an hour later, still thinking about the day's developments. Dad, how are you feeling about all this? Cal looked up at his daughter, who had inherited Elena's ability to ask exactly the right question at exactly the right moment. Scared, he said honestly, but also hopeful. Your mother always said the best decisions were the ones that scared you and excited you at the same time. She was a smart woman. She was. And she would have liked Jordan, I think. She would have seen what I'm starting to see, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone learn how to help others. Outside, the evening was settling over their community, and Cal could imagine a future where children played safely in areas that were now contaminated, where families worked in buildings that supported health rather than threatening it, where environmental responsibility and economic opportunity grew together like seeds planted in clean soil. It would take time and money and more faith than any of them had initially imagined. But for the first time since the factory closed, Cal felt like they were working towards something worthy of their hopes. The town hall microphone had seen better days. Its cord was taped in 3 places, its stand wobbled slightly, and feedback occasionally squealed through the sound system when someone moved too close. But tonight, in the auditorium of Lincoln Elementary School, that unreliable microphone would carry the most important conversation their community had held in decades. Cal arrived early, partly to help Jordan set up their presentation materials and partly because he needed time to settle his nerves. At 58, he had spoken publicly exactly 3 times in his life: at Elena's funeral, at Maria's high school graduation, and once at a factory union meeting when they were negotiating shift schedules. Tonight felt more consequential than all of those combined. How many people are we expecting? Jordan asked, adjusting his laptop connection to the school's aging projector. Hard to say, Rosa replied, arranging folding chairs in neat rows. Everyone got the flyer, but that doesn't mean they'll come. Some folks are curious, some are suspicious, and some are just tired of meetings that end with nothing changing. The community meeting had been 6 weeks in the planning, ever since word of the environmental cleanup had spread throughout the area. Jordan had insisted on complete transparency about the project's scope, costs, and timeline, which meant acknowledging uncertainties that most developers preferred to minimize. Tonight's presentation would lay out everything: the contamination report, the cleanup plan, the manufacturing proposal, and most importantly, the community's role in deciding whether to move forward. Diego arrived with boxes of handouts and a thermos of coffee, having taken the evening off from his grocery store job to help with setup. Over the past month, he had emerged as an unexpected leader among the younger community members, organizing informal discussion groups and gathering input about what people actually wanted from economic development. Any word from the opposition group? Cal asked. Jim Morrison's been making calls all week, Diego replied, telling people this is just another scheme to gentrify the neighborhood and price out long-time residents. Jim's opposition wasn't entirely unfounded. Other communities had experienced well-intentioned development projects that ultimately displaced the very people they were supposed to help. His skepticism represented legitimate concerns about outside control and unintended consequences. What's our response to that? Jordan asked. Truth, Maria said, arriving with a stack of medical journals under her arm. We acknowledge the concern, and explain how our community ownership structure addresses it. Maria had spent weeks researching similar projects, documenting both successes and failures in community-based economic development. Her analysis had helped shape their approach to ensuring local control and preventing displacement. Pete arrived with his usual punctuality, carrying a toolbox that had become a symbol of practical competence throughout the planning process. Behind him came a stream of people Cal had known for years: former factory workers, small business owners, teachers, retirees, young families with children. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 70s but still sharp as the day she'd taught Jordan in 3rd grade, took a seat in the front row and nodded approvingly at the presentation setup. Her converted Honda Civic had become a neighborhood sensation, demonstrating both the technical quality of their work and their commitment to serving community members rather than just wealthy customers. "Cal," she said warmly, "Elena would be so proud of what you're doing here." The compliment touched him deeply, but also added weight to the responsibility he felt. Elena had always believed in the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they worked together with purpose and integrity. As 7 o'clock approached, the auditorium filled with a cross-section of their community. Cal recognized faces from the grocery store, the diner, the gas station, the church. These were people who had weathered the factory closure together, who had helped each other through unemployment and medical bills and family crises. Tonight, they would decide whether to bet their collective future on a vision that promised both opportunity and risk. Jordan stood at the podium looking nervous but determined. Over the past 2 months, he had transformed from a confident billionaire with grand plans into something more valuable, collaborative partner who understood that true leadership meant helping others make good decisions rather than imposing solutions from above. "Before we start," Cal said, taking the microphone first, "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I know we're all busy, I know we've heard promises before that didn't pan out, and I know some of you are wondering whether this is worth your time." He looked around the room, making eye contact with people he'd known for decades. "The truth is, I don't know if this project will succeed. I don't know if we can build a sustainable business, or if the environmental cleanup will work the way we hope, or if the jobs we create will be the kind of jobs our children want to have." "Then why are we here?" called out Jim Morrison from the back of the room. "Because," Cal replied, "I know what happens if we don't try. I know what it looks like when communities give up on themselves. I know what it feels like to watch young people leave because there's nothing here for them, and I know what it means for families to struggle without hope that things can get better." He paused, thinking about Elena's advice to speak from the heart rather than from prepared remarks. 20 years ago, I helped a hungry kid by paying for his lunches. I didn't do it because I expected anything in return. I did it because it was the right thing to do. That kid grew up to be Jordan Lee, and now he's trying to help us the same way I tried to help him, not because he expects something back, but because it's the right thing to do. The room was completely quiet, which Cal took as either a good sign or a very bad one. "But here's the thing," he continued. "Jordan can't save our community any more than I could save him by buying his lunches. What I could do was give him the support he needed to save himself. What Jordan can do is give us the support we need to save ourselves." He handed the microphone to Jordan, who had been listening with the focused attention of someone understanding the weight of the moment. "Mr. Mendoza is right," Jordan began. "I can't save your community, and honestly, I don't think your community needs saving. What I see here is a place with skilled workers, strong families, and neighbors who take care of each other. Those are the foundations of prosperity, not the obstacles to it." Jordan clicked to his first slide, which showed not financial projections, but photographs of community members at work: Pete teaching electric motor repair, Rosa organizing training sessions, Diego helping with car conversions, Maria volunteering at the health clinic. "What I can offer is partnership, capital to fund environmental cleanup and facility development, technical expertise to compete in the electric vehicle market. business connections to help us reach customers and suppliers. But the success of this project depends entirely on your decisions, your work, and your commitment to each other. He outlined the community ownership structure they had developed, which would give local residents equity stakes in the business and decision-making power over major operational choices. He explained the environmental cleanup timeline and the independent monitoring that would ensure public safety. He detailed job creation projections and wage ranges, acknowledging that some positions would require retraining and that not every job would be suitable for every worker. The bottom line, Jordan said, is that this is your choice. You can vote tonight to move forward with this project, or you can decide it's not right for your community. Either way, I'll respect your decision and continue to support the vehicle conversion work we've already started. The presentation phase lasted 40 minutes, followed by an hour of questions that ranged from technical details about battery recycling to philosophical concerns about corporate influence on community culture. Cal was impressed by the thoughtfulness of the questions and the respectfulness of the discussion, even when people disagreed with each other. Jim Morrison asked the hardest questions, challenging assumptions about job security, environmental safety, and long-term business viability. But his questions weren't hostile. They were the questions of someone who cared about his community and wanted to make sure they weren't making decisions based on wishful thinking. My concern, Jim said during his final question, is that we're being asked to trust people we barely know with our economic future. What happens if this doesn't work out the way you're projecting? Jordan looked at Cal before answering, and Cal nodded encouragement. Mr. Morrison, you're absolutely right to be skeptical, Jordan replied. I'm asking you to trust someone you've known for 2 months with decisions that will affect your community for years. The only thing I can tell you is this. My commitment to this project doesn't depend on its profitability. Whether this business succeeds or fails, the environmental cleanup will be completed, the worker training will be funded, and the community ownership structure will remain in place. That's an expensive promise, Jim observed. It's the right promise, Jordan said simply. As the formal presentation concluded, people gathered in small groups to continue discussions that had started during the question period. Cal watched these conversations with satisfaction, recognizing the kind of thoughtful deliberation that characterized his community at its best. People weren't rushing to judgment, they were wrestling with complex questions that deserved careful consideration. Rosa stood near the back of the room, surrounded by former factory workers who peppered her with questions about working conditions, union representation, and advancement opportunities. Her responses were measured and honest, acknowledging uncertainties while emphasizing the community's role in shaping workplace policies. Pete found himself explaining technical aspects of electric vehicle manufacturing to a group that included 2 mechanics, a retired engineer, and several parents whose children might someday work in the proposed facility. His credibility on mechanical matters carried weight with people who understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Maria moved between groups, answering questions about the health implications of environmental cleanup and the medical benefits of reducing air pollution. Her medical training lent authority to discussions about community wellness that went beyond economic considerations. Diego was surrounded by people his own age and younger, some of whom had left town for college or work and returned for tonight's meeting. Their questions focused on whether the project would create opportunities that might convince them to stay or return permanently. The vote is in 2 weeks, Cal announced as the evening wound down. Ballots will be available at the library, the community center, and the school office. Everyone 18 and older who lives in the district is eligible to participate. What constitutes approval? Asked Sarah Williams, the librarian. Simple majority of votes cast, Rosa replied. We talked about requiring a supermajority, but decided that if we can't convince more than half the community, we probably shouldn't move forward anyway. As people began gathering their coats and heading for the parking lot, Cal felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The presentation had gone better than he'd hoped. People had asked smart questions, engaged seriously with the proposal, and treated each other with respect, even when they disagreed. But the real test would come over the next 2 weeks, as community members discussed the project in their homes, at work, and in the informal gatherings where important decisions were often made. Jordan approached him as he was stacking chairs. "How do you think it went?" "Better than I expected," Cal replied honestly. "People listened, asked good questions, treated you with respect. That's more than some communities would have done." "But will they vote yes?" Cal paused in his chair, stacking to consider the question. "I think they'll vote their conscience, which is all we can ask for. Some folks are excited about the possibilities, some are worried about the risks, and some are still trying to figure out what they think. What about you? How are you feeling about everything?" Cal looked around the elementary school auditorium where his children had attended programs and where he'd voted in dozens of elections over the years. The space represented continuity, community, and the democratic process that allowed ordinary people to shape their collective future. "I'm feeling like Elena would be proud," he said finally. "Not necessarily of the outcome, we don't know what that will be yet, but of the process. Of the way people came together tonight to wrestle with hard questions and treat each other with dignity." As they turned off the lights and locked up the school, Cal reflected on how much had changed since that morning 2 months earlier, when he'd found a luxury car in his parking space. The car itself seemed almost irrelevant, now a symbol of generosity that had sparked something larger and more important than any individual gift. The real transformation had been in the relationships formed, the skills developed, the confidence rebuilt, and the vision created of what their community could become. Whether that vision would be realized depended on forces beyond anyone's control, but the process of creating it together had already changed everyone involved. "Jordan," Cal said as they reached their cars, "whatever happens with the vote, I want you to know that these past 2 months have been good for all of us. You've helped us remember that we have power to shape our own future. And you've helped me understand what that power is actually for," Jordan replied. 2 weeks later, Cal would stand at this same microphone to announce the results of the community vote. But tonight, driving home through streets he'd traveled thousands of times before, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Elena's death. The deep satisfaction that comes from working alongside others towards something worthy of their best efforts. The outcome was important, but the effort itself had already proven that their community possessed the wisdom, courage, and commitment necessary to face whatever challenges lay ahead. That knowledge, Cal reflected as he pulled into his parking space beside the Tesla that had started everything, was perhaps the most valuable gift Jordan had given them, not the promise of prosperity, but the reminder of their own capacity for hope. Cal's grandfather's pocket watch had stopped working 15 years ago, but he still carried it on important occasions, feeling the weight of it in his vest pocket like a reminder of time's steady passage and the responsibility each generation bears to the next. Tonight, as he stood backstage in the school auditorium waiting to announce the vote results, the watch seemed heavier than usual. The past 2 weeks had been intense with door-to-door conversations, coffee shop debates, and kitchen table discussions that stretched late into the evening. Cal had tried to stay neutral, answering questions when asked, but avoiding advocacy that might seem to pressure people toward a particular decision. The choice belonged to the community, not to him. But neutrality had been harder to maintain than he'd anticipated. Every conversation had reminded him of what was at stake, not just jobs and economic development, but the community's sense of itself as a place where people could build meaningful lives together. The project had become a referendum on hope itself, on whether they believed their best days were ahead of them or behind them. The auditorium was packed again, with folding chairs added along the walls and people standing in the back when seating ran out. The crowd included faces Cal hadn't seen at the first meeting, relatives who had driven in from nearby towns, former residents who had moved away but maintained emotional connections to the community, young adults who had been away at college but returned to participate in a decision about their hometown's future. Rosa sat in the front row with a manila envelope containing the ballot count, her expression carefully neutral. As the person who had supervised the voting process, she knew the results, but had agreed to let Cal make the announcement. Pete sat beside her, his calloused hands folded in his lap, looking like a man who had made peace with whatever outcome awaited them. Jordan occupied a seat near the middle of the auditorium, deliberately avoiding any position that might suggest special status or influence. Over the past 2 weeks, he had maintained a low profile, answering questions when approached, but otherwise letting community members debate among themselves without interference from the person whose money would fund the project. Diego and Maria sat together toward the back, their presence representing the generation that would inherit whatever decision was made tonight. Both had been active in encouraging voter participation, but like their father, they had avoided taking public positions that might influence others. Mrs. Patterson sat in her customary front row seat, the same spot she had occupied for school board meetings and community events for decades. Her presence reminded everyone that this decision would affect multiple generations, that choices made tonight would shape the experiences of children not yet born. Cal approached the microphone at exactly 7 o'clock, feeling the familiar wobble in its stand and hearing the slight feedback that announced the beginning of formal proceedings. The room fell quiet with the expectant hush that accompanies important moments. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility he felt. "Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you to everyone who participated in the voting process over the past 2 weeks. Regardless of the outcome, the fact that so many people engaged thoughtfully with this decision demonstrates the strength of our community." He paused, looking out at faces that represented decades of shared history, neighbors who had supported each other through factory layoffs and medical emergencies, friends who had celebrated marriages and mourned losses together, families who had chosen to stay in this place, even when economic pressures made leaving seem more practical. "Before I announce the results," Cal continued, "I want to acknowledge that this hasn't been an easy decision for anyone. The questions we've been wrestling with about economic development, environmental responsibility, community control, and our collective future don't have simple answers. Reasonable people can look at the same information and reach different conclusions." From the crowd came murmurs of agreement. The campaign period had been remarkably civil, with disagreements expressed respectfully and opposing viewpoints treated with consideration rather than hostility. "What I've seen over the past 2 weeks has made me proud to be part of this community," Cal said. "I've seen neighbors listening to each other with patience and respect. I've seen people changing their minds when presented with new information. I've seen folks putting the collective good ahead of their personal preferences." He reached into his pocket and felt the smooth metal of his grandfather's watch, drawing strength from the connection to previous generations who had faced their own difficult decisions about community and future. Elena always said that democracy isn't about getting the right answer, it's about asking the right questions and trusting people to make thoughtful decisions based on their values and their understanding of what's best for everyone. Cal's voice grew stronger as he continued, "Whatever the outcome tonight, we've honored that process." The room was completely silent now, the kind of focused quiet that accompanies moments when everyone understands they are witnessing something significant. Cal looked toward Rosa, who stood and walked to the podium carrying the envelope that contained their collective decision. "The total number of eligible voters in our district is 847, Cal announced, reading from Rosa's careful notes. "The total number of ballots cast was 730, only an 86% participation rate that demonstrates how seriously our community takes this responsibility." He opened the envelope with steady hands, though his heart was beating faster than usual. The paper inside contained not just numbers, but the community's verdict on their shared future, their collective answer to the question of whether hope was worth the risk of disappointment. "The question on the ballot," Cal continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "was whether our community should proceed with the proposed electric vehicle manufacturing project, including environmental cleanup and community ownership structure. The results are as follows. He paused, looking down at the paper in his hands, then back up at the sea of faces, waiting for news that would shape their collective future. Votes in favor of proceeding with the project, 389. Votes against proceeding, 342. The measure passes by a margin of 47 votes. The auditorium erupted in a mixture of cheers, applause, and quiet conversations as people processed the narrow victory. Cal waited for the noise to subside, understanding that this moment required both celebration and acknowledgement of the community's divided opinion. "I want to emphasize," he continued when quiet returned, "that this was not a landslide. More than 40% of our neighbors voted against this project, and their concerns deserve our continued attention and respect. Moving forward will require all of us supporters and skeptics alike to work together to ensure this project serves our entire community." From the middle of the room, Jordan rose to his feet. The auditorium fell silent again as people waited to hear from the man whose vision and resources would now become reality. "Thank you," Jordan said simply, his voice carrying emotion he hadn't shown during the campaign period. "I'm honored by your trust, and I'm committed to proving that it was well placed." But it was what happened next that Cal would remember most clearly years later. Instead of remaining at the podium to deliver a victory speech, Jordan walked directly to Jim Morrison, who had led much of the opposition to the project. "Mr. Morrison," Jordan said, extending his hand, "I know you have serious concerns about this project. I hope you'll consider serving on the Community Oversight Committee because we need people who will ask hard questions and hold us accountable." Jim looked surprised, but shook Jordan's hand firmly. "I appreciate that, and if you're serious about community control, you'll need skeptics as much as supporters." "I'm counting on it," Jordan replied. The exchange set a tone that carried through the rest of the evening. People who had voted on different sides of the issue found themselves in conversations about implementation rather than opposition, about how to make the project work rather than whether it should proceed. Rosa took the microphone to outline next steps: formation of the Oversight Committee, environmental cleanup timeline, worker training program development. Her presentation was practical and detailed, focusing on concrete actions rather than abstract promises. Pete added technical perspective about facility preparation and equipment procurement, his credibility lending weight to projections about timeline and workforce needs. His comments sparked questions from community members who wanted to understand their potential roles in the project. Maria spoke about the health benefits of environmental cleanup and the medical monitoring program that would track community wellness throughout the process. Her scientific training provided reassurance to parents concerned about their children's safety. Diego, speaking publicly for the first time during the entire process, addressed his generation's perspective on the project. "This gives us a reason to stay," he said simply, "or to come back if we've left. It says our community believes in its own future enough to invest in it." As the formal meeting concluded and people began moving toward the exits, Cal found himself surrounded by neighbors wanting to shake hands, offer congratulations, or express continued concerns about the project's implementation. Each conversation reminded him of the responsibility he now carried as a bridge between Jordan's resources and his community's needs. Mrs. Patterson approached him as he was gathering his notes. "Carlos," she said, "Elena would be so proud of what you've accomplished here. But more than that, she'd be proud of how you've done it with dignity and respect for everyone involved." The comment touched him deeply, partly because Mrs. Patterson had known Elena well and partly because it captured something he'd been trying to achieve throughout the entire process, the kind of leadership that brought out the best in others rather than demanding they follow. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That means more to me than you know." As the auditorium emptied, Cal stood alone at the podium for a moment, looking out at the rows of empty chairs and thinking about the conversations that had taken place here over the past 2 months. The space had hosted doubt and hope, skepticism and vision, fear and courage, all the emotions that accompany significant change. Jordan approached him as he was turning off the lights. "How are you feeling?" Cal considered the question seriously. Grateful, nervous, hopeful, responsible. He paused. Mostly grateful. Grateful that our community had this conversation. Grateful that people participated thoughtfully. Grateful that we found a path forward that honors both our hopes and our concerns. And now the real work begins, Jordan observed. Now the real work begins, Cal agreed. As they walked toward the parking lot, Cal touched his grandfather's pocket watch through his vest. Time would tell whether tonight's decision would prove wise, but the process that led to it had already demonstrated something important about their community's character and capacity for collective action. The vote was over, but the story was just beginning. Outside, the autumn air carried the promise of winter and the distant hope of spring, and Cal felt ready for whatever seasons lay ahead. 6 months later, Cal stood in the main assembly area of what had once been Millbrook Manufacturing, watching the first electric vehicle roll off their production line. The car was Modesta compact sedan, designed for families who needed reliable, affordable transportation, but it represented something much larger than its practical specifications suggested. The key Jordan placed in his hand was warm from the afternoon sun, streaming through factory windows that had been cleaned and repaired as part of the facility renovation. Unlike the Tesla that had appeared in his driveway 8 months earlier, this car belonged not to him individually, but to the community collectively, the first fruit of a partnership that had transformed both the factory and the people who worked in it. "You should be the one to start her up," Jordan said, stepping back from the vehicle with obvious pride and satisfaction. Cal looked around the production floor, where 47 workers were finishing their shifts with the quiet competence that had always characterized this community's approach to manufacturing. Rosa supervised the quality control station, her attention to detail ensuring that every component met standards that would keep families safe on the roads. Pete led a team of technicians who had mastered electric motor assembly with the same precision they'd once brought to traditional automotive systems. Diego worked alongside former factory veterans and recent technical school graduates, his natural mechanical ability now focused on sustainable transportation technology. The environmental cleanup had taken longer than originally projected, but had been completed to standards that exceeded regulatory requirements. Independent monitoring confirmed that soil and groundwater met safety levels that would protect both workers and the surrounding community for generations. The process had created temporary employment for dozens of community members who gained valuable skills in environmental remediation while contributing to their neighborhood's renewal. "This feels different from anything I expected," Cal said, settling into the driver's seat of the vehicle that bore a small plaque reading, "Community Vehicle 1." The car started with the quiet hum that characterized electric motors, but what struck Cal most was the feeling of completion it represented. Not just the completion of a manufacturing process, but the fulfillment of promises made between neighbors who had chosen to trust each other with their collective future. Maria had graduated from medical school the previous month and accepted a position at the community health center, where she would provide primary care for families whose health insurance improved significantly when factory jobs returned to the area. Her student loans were manageable thanks to a loan forgiveness program Jordan had established for community members pursuing careers that served local needs. Diego had enrolled in community college part-time while working full-time at the factory, pursuing an associate degree in sustainable technology that would prepare him for advancement within the company or transfer to other green energy employers. His combination of practical experience and formal education represented exactly the kind of career pathway the project was designed to create. The worker cooperative structure had evolved beyond their initial plans, with employees owning 40% of the business and holding seats on the board of directors that made major operational decisions. Profit sharing ensured that the factory's success translated directly into improved living standards for the families who made that success possible. "You know what I've learned?" Jordan asked, as they drove the new car through streets that looked subtly different than they had 8 months earlier. "What's that?" "That helping people isn't about giving them what you think they need. It's about creating conditions where they can help themselves and each other. Cal nodded, thinking about the way their project had rippled outward from the factory to affect other aspects of community life. The environmental cleanup had sparked interest in sustainable development practices throughout the area. Worker training programs had attracted young adults who might otherwise have left for opportunities elsewhere. The cooperative ownership model was being studied by other communities facing similar economic transitions. Elena always said the best gifts were the ones that kept giving long after the original gesture was forgotten, Cal replied. This feels like one of those gifts. They drove past the elementary school, where Mrs. Patterson still taught third grade, now in classrooms with updated ventilation systems funded by the factory's community investment program. They passed the library where Sarah Williams had expanded programming to include technical literacy courses for workers adapting to new manufacturing methods. They drove through neighborhoods where property values were rising gradually enough to reflect renewed economic stability, but not so rapidly as to displace long-time residents. As they returned to the factory, Cal could see the community garden that workers had established on a portion of the cleaned-up land, where families grew vegetables using sustainable farming techniques and shared harvests with neighbors who needed additional food support. The garden represented the same principles that governed the factory: collective effort, shared benefit, and long-term thinking about community health. "There's something I want to show you," Jordan said as they parked the car in the visitors section of the employee lot. He led Cal to a small plaque mounted near the factory's main entrance, its bronze surface bearing an inscription that read, "In memory of Elena Mendoza, who understood that kindness works best when nobody's watching, and in honor of all the invisible acts of generosity that make communities possible." Cal stared at the plaque for a long moment, touched by the gesture, but also by its recognition that their project was part of a larger tradition of mutual support that had always sustained places like theirs. "She would have liked this," he said finally. Not the recognition, but the idea that her understanding of kindness became part of something bigger. As the afternoon shift ended and workers headed home to families whose futures looked brighter than they had in years, Cal reflected on the distance they had traveled since that morning when he'd found a luxury car in his parking space. The car itself sat in his driveway, mostly unused, reminder of generosity received and responsibility accepted. But the real transformation had been in relationships formed, skills developed, confidence rebuilt, and hope restored. 20 years earlier, he had paid for a hungry child's lunch because it was the right thing to do. Today, that child had helped him feed an entire community's dreams, proving that small acts of kindness could indeed echo across decades and change everything. The circle was complete, but the story continued, carried forward by workers heading home to dinner tables where they would share the day's accomplishments with children who might someday inherit a world where sustainable prosperity and community care were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of a life well lived. Cal touched his grandfather's pocket watch, still carrying time that had stopped years ago, but still marking moments that mattered, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work, worthy of the effort it requires.